It's time for another Mailbag Friday in this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. You also can catch us on wherever you get your podcasts. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, we're on Odyssey and YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you're a first-time listener and you want to know a little bit more about me and this show, I am based here in Kansas City, as you can tell right now, not in my usual podcasting room. That's because I'm at work, where I am at Sports Radio 810 WHB. I do some hosting, co-hosting, and some producing as well. But when it comes to this podcast, when you click on this link, you know that you're going to be getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, where new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. Well, for this edition, we got about 20 or so questions to get to, some coming from YouTube, some coming from Twitter. Again, if you are that new listener, you can just respond to any video of the week with your question. I'll be sure to get the notification. And then if you also want to do it through Twitter, just look for my tweet that I put out every single Thursday evening. You can respond there, or you can direct message me if you don't want your question to be public. But first question today comes on YouTube from Grant. With reports coming out that Alex Bregman and Santander may be open to short-term deals, what are your thoughts on getting Santander on a one-year deal as the power bat as a stopgap for Jack Caglione? I used to be against the thought because I didn't know how they could fit him in the lineup with Salvi needing the DH in the future, but on a one-year deal, I think that solves the issue. You know, I do think I could see Anthony Santander taking a shorter-term deal. I don't think it'll be as short as a one-year deal. I think his hope going into the offseason was a 5-year deal, 5 to 6 maybe, and now I'd imagine he's closer to a 3 to a 4-year deal. I would be floored if he signed a one-year deal. And in my opinion, the only way that would happen is if we saw something similar to last year where Jordan Montgomery and Blake Snell waited through spring training and then signed a one-year deal because they couldn't get anything else. I don't see that being the same for Santander. I'd imagine once the calendar flips to February that we will be seeing Santander signed somewhere on a multiple-year deal, probably closer to 3 to 4, because I'm just not sure anybody would give him a 5-year deal. But if it did get to that point as a one-year deal, I'd be all for it because I'm all for one-year deals. I just don't see it getting to that point. If the Royals were to get a stopgap guy, I think it'd be much cheaper on a one-year deal than what Anthony Santander would be making. But still a good question there coming from Grant. Next one is from MFall on Twitter. Probably know the answer, but what are the odds we pick up a bat before spring training? I'm just not going to go back on anything I said, and I'm not against doing that at any point throughout this podcast, right? I've definitely gone back before and criticized myself for making a certain pick, or I have, changed up my answer based on things I had heard or things that had been rumored out there. But when it comes to this outfield bat or this middle of the order bat, I'm just not going to go back on it. I remain very confident the Royals will bring in a bat of some sort before spring training, just because I think that was priority number 2 or 3 on the offseason wish list. And I still have confidence in it because I think the rest of the market and the rest of the teams out there are also being patient. If the Royals were the only team not making moves, then I would be a little bit more confident that a move would not be happening. But since everybody's being so patient, I still believe wholeheartedly that a bat will be there before spring training. If there isn't one, then I'd imagine at some point in the middle portion of spring training, somebody would be coming in. But knowing the Royals, knowing what J.J. Picollo would want to do, I feel like he would want to have his lineup pretty much set before the full squad workout coming up here in about a month or so. This one comes from Aiden. How would you feel about signing Pete Alonso to a 2-year, $60 million deal with an opt-out after year one. I think it would be a good bridge gap to when Jack makes the big league team, and I think that takes the pressure off Vinny to play first base every day. Pete Alonso, to me, since he declined the 3-year offer from the Mets, is not going to be looking at a 2-year deal, and especially in a place like Kansas City. It's no knock on Kansas City. Of course, I do this podcast because I love the Royals, but guys like Pete Alonso, they're going to be shooting for the moon, and they're not going to settle for anything less. And I imagine he's pretty pissed off that the Mets would be moving on from him. I mean, I feel like he viewed himself as the key piece to that team. He's no Francisco Lindor, but Pete Alonso is very much known as a Mets great. And now that he's not going to be returning to New York, at least that's not the vibe we get from that situation, I think he's going to be looking for a 3 to 4 year deal, maybe even more than that, for a team that is going to overpay him a little bit. A dark horse team that I think should be looked out for is maybe somebody like Toronto or Detroit, because they're both in on Anthony Santander. But the problem is that the Tigers have Spencer Torkelson. Not that they would, pick Torkelson over Pete Alonso, but I just don't think they're going to give up on Torkelson, and also Vladdy Jr.'s in Toronto. But those are two guys that wanted Anthony Santander, or two teams, that want Anthony Santander. Now that Pete Alonso is available, he could be their DH option, or you move one of your guys across the diamond or to the DH spot to make room for Pete Alonso. I just don't see the Royals being that team that, looking for that middle of the order bat, it would be someone like Pete Alonso, for as expensive as he's going to be, because he's a first baseman only. The Royals love Vinny Pasquantino. They view him as their first baseman. And if Jack Caglione gets up here in 2025 or next year, I don't think that ends the road for Vinny. I think that more so either moves Jack to the outfield, or that would just move Vinny to the DH role. But I just don't think it's very likely at this point that Pete Alonso and the Royals would have any sort of interest, or mutual interest for that matter. This one comes from Maxwell. Could the reason that the Royals have interest in Jack moving to the outfield be because they believe Vinny won't just be a DH in the future? I think they want to move him to the outfield if things go well offensively, because that would mean they believe 2025 could be his target date, right? I think the only reason you would put him in the outfield is so that there is room on the roster this year for him to play. And I don't think that would move him permanently to the outfield. But if he goes into Double-A and he's hitting 340 and he's got an OBP north of 400, well, I think you could start making that transition of, we feel like he's going to help out the big league club in the second half of the season, but the outfield's a lot easier to make room for than first bases, because Vinny's a huge part of the team. Vinny's a huge part of their offensive production. So Jack moving to the outfield isn't about, well, Vinny's going to be the first baseman in the future. I think it's just isolated to the 2025 team. I still have firm belief that when Jack Caglione makes it up full-time, unless he's just some elite defender in the outfield, he would be the first baseman of the future. Things can always change because if Vinny plays well at first base and they want to leave that DH spot open, and also I want to add on this, the Royals are very flexible with their lineup. I don't really feel like, other than Bobby Witt Jr. and Kyle Isbell, and now I guess Michael Massey or Jonathan India, but even one of those guys may move. They move guys around. Like Jack Caglione and Vinny Pasquantino could split time at first base. And when Caglione's at first base, Vinny's DHing. When Vinny's at first base, Caglione's in the outfield. They like that flexibility. So I don't think it means anything more than they feel like there's a world in which Jack Caglione gets up to the big league level in 2025, and they want to have room for both Vinny, Salvi, and Caglione in the lineup. Let's take one more here before we go to break. Devin asks, would Santander make a good middle-of-the-order bat if he signed a short-term deal? So similar to what we answered with the first question today, I just don't think that the Royals and Santander are going to be a fit unless that price comes way down. Because Santander, for the most part, is a DH only. He can play the outfield. I'm not saying he's going to provide great defensive value out there, but he can go out there and handle, the position in right field. But he is, for the most part, a DH only. And I do wonder if some of those numbers would dip in a different ballpark, comparing Camden Yards to Kauffman Stadium. I'd be ecstatic about the signing. I just don't think there's been any smoke around the Royals and Santander. Only thing I've seen is in a couple of articles, the Royals be seen as a fit, but that's just a fit because they need a middle-of-the-order bat. But in terms of that short-term deal, I don't see it getting down to a 1 or 2 year deal. I see it more likely being a 3 to 4 year deal. But who knows? Things can always get a little bit tricky when it comes to those free agent prices coming down the closer we get to spring training. All right, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, still a lot of questions to get to next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Our first sponsor that I want to give a shout out to is Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? Definitely happened to me, and I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was paying for. And Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved over a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. So the next round of questions we are going to get to begins with Wick. The time window to win is now. After extending Witt, why did we decide to go cheap this offseason? Makes no sense. Sherman is starting to make me feel like it's the Glass era all over again. Well, I don't necessarily think it's been the cheapness part of it. I really do believe it. I'm not trying to make excuses for the lack of noise this offseason, but the market's just been stale. I mean, the Royals did make some pretty significant moves. It was just early on in the offseason. I mean, giving Michael Wacha a 3-year deal worth $51 million and then trading Brady Singer for Jonathan India and bringing back Michael Lorenzen on a 1-year deal. Like, those are moves, in my opinion, that just wouldn't have happened in the Glass era. And quite frankly, I'm not sure they would have happened in the Dayton Moore era. But I understand that a lot of fans out there are still agitated about the lack of rumors and the lack of movement when it comes to a middle-of-the-order bat. And what I would say to that is once the market really starts kicking in, and I know I've said that right now it's January 17th, I believe. You get to February 1 and nothing's happened. I think that clock starts ticking a little bit because pitchers and catchers report in 2 weeks. You want to be sure to have that guy in your lineup when the full squad workouts happen. But it really comes down to the market, in my opinion, or just some teams are going to be more aggressive, right? The Royals could be waiting and waiting and waiting, and then that market just stays quiet, stays ice cold, and then they're going to go jump on somebody. But I still believe that middle-of-the-order bat is going to come through the trade route. That's just what's been said all offseason long. But the market's stale right now. I don't think, though, it's the same era as the Glass era. I think last year was very aggressive because they had to be. They had so many holes on the team to replace, and how could they not? I mean, they lost 106 games. This time around, they went 86 and 76 and got to the second round of the postseason. There were less holes to fill, which allows you to be a little bit more patient for who you really want to help your lineup, help your rotation, help your bullpen. And I still believe, and I'm very confident in the fact they're going to bring in somebody. I just don't have a list of 3 or 4 people. I think we've kind of circled back around to the same names every single time. But I don't think this is the same as the Glass era. I don't think, any big move was ever made or any extension was ever given, it felt like. That's been a little bit different in the John Sherman era. Ballistic Bubich asks, could Ke'Bryan Hayes be an answer if the team did pivot to a third baseman instead of an outfielder for the middle-of-the-order bat? I did come across that news the other day, and it surprised me because I thought the Pirates have invested a lot into Ke'Bryan Hayes. Health has been a big part of it, and I do think Ke'Bryan Hayes would fit perfectly for the Royals, mainly on the defensive side of things. I mean, you'd have the best left side defensively in baseball with Bobby Witt Jr. and Ke'Bryan Hayes. But when you're talking about somebody like Hayes, he's not cheap. And the fact that the trade market has been so quiet, it makes me believe that, the asking prices are astronomical. And for somebody like Ke'Bryan Hayes, even with those injuries, that's a very high asking price. And I just don't think the Royals want to give up what the Pirates would be asking for. I think they've got some untouchables now at the minor league system. That includes Jack Caglione. I think that includes Blake Mitchell. And in their eyes, I think Carter Jensen is on that list. Blake Walters might be on that list. Not sure on Ben Kudrna. I feel like he could be a big trade chip if, the Royals were in it at the trade deadline and they wanted to bring back a significant piece. But somebody like Ke'Bryan Hayes, as much of a good fit as he'd be in Kansas City, I think that asking price would be way too high just because of, how young he is and how much the Pirates value him. And when he's the one asking for a trade, I think the Pirates would really rather work things out than move him on to somewhere else. Dave's question is, Gavin Cross make it to the big leagues anytime soon? I think he's going to have a chance this year. It was definitely great to see last year early on that he was starting to progress offensively at the plate. You saw a little bit more of the pop. You saw good on-base numbers. I don't think the ceiling's as high. I think he's, a stopgap starter right now at best. That can always change. Prospects can go up and down every single year. But I do think he gets to the big league level at some point this season, whether it be due to injuries or he's up for a doubleheader. I think he gets an opportunity because of the outfield depth, both at the major league level and the minor league level. I mean, Tyler Gentry got a shot last season, late in the year. I could see Gavin Cross getting a shot like that in August or July or September for that matter. But he's got to continue to stay healthy. He's got to continue to improve at the plate because there could be a spot for him in the outfield. I just wouldn't be sold he would be the answer for an extended period of time. He would really have to blossom this year. I think not just at the plate, actually. I think he would have to blossom in the field as well, one of those corner outfield spots. Mike asks, what's the point of keeping Waters and Prado around if it's clear the organization doesn't believe in them? Prado not getting a look when Pasquantino got hurt tells you everything you need to know about how they view him. I think that's a fine way to look at it. That's the way I took it last year when Vinny went down. They had Nick Lofton at first base, and then they went out there and got Tommy Pham and Robbie Grossman and tried to piece together that lineup, Yuli Gurriel as well. That told you a lot of how they view Nick Prado and Drew Waters, for that matter, at the major league level. The reason you keep them around is more so emergency. I think just having that depth, both of them have played at the big league level. If you needed them in a pinch, they could come up to the big league level. And maybe that doesn't remain the same after spring training. There's always a chance they move on from those guys. But to me, the reason you keep them is just for minor league depth. I mean, every team out there has guys that have been bounced around between the big league level and AAA, every single year of their career. And that's the way I think their role is going to be in 2025, unless there were multiple injuries and something opened up for them. But to me, I don't think there's any harm in keeping them as organizational depth than trying to trade them, because I don't think there's much trade value there either. I think those are two guys that will probably just be 4A contributors for the majority of their time in the Kansas City organization. JHB asks, are they going to trade or sign a bat for the middle of the order? I still say stay pretty consistent with it being the trade route there. I think the Royals don't want to go way over the payroll, but they may have to. That's the reality of this. If you can't strike a deal through trade for that middle of the order bat, you're going to have to spend some money to get the middle of the order bat. And I will say this, I said pretty confident. I'm not going to say pretty confident moving forward, because there's a world in which the trade market just never really materializes. It could be a very stale market, and the Royals have to pivot to somebody on a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal to be that middle of the order bat. Randall Grichuk is somebody that kind of comes to mind free agent-wise if they are to pivot to free agency. But I think I would still say 60-40 right now. They would like to trade for that bat, and they can strike a deal. But the closer we get to mid-February, the more that percentage comes down a little bit. So, I do think at this point in time, it's still going to be trading for a middle-of-the-order bat, but I can also see a world now in which that just doesn't work out, and they're going to have to go through free agency. Okay, let's take our final break of the show. When we come back, we'll wrap it all up with our final questions on a Mailbag Friday. You are tuned into Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Our last sponsor I want to give a shout out to is FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And as I just brought up, the NFL playoffs will be in full swing this weekend. Have a great slate coming up. I know for a lot of people here in Kansas City, you're already making plans for the Chiefs and Texans tomorrow. But I'm going to go with the Lions and the Commanders game for my pick. I'm taking the over on total yards for Jahmyr Gibbs. I think he has a big-time performance and a win over the Washington Commanders. Okay, we still have a final list of questions here on Twitter. Should be able to get to every single one of them. Brett asked, what is the highest do you think the Royals will ever be ranked amongst other teams in payroll? They currently are well in the bottom half. Do you ever see them getting into the top half? It's a great question because I think every Royals fan has asked that question at some point in time. And the reality is, too, you don't need to have the top payroll in baseball to be successful. I know it feels that way after last year because the Yankees and Dodgers were there at the top. But I think the highest they could ever get would maybe be 10th. And that would take a absurd type of offseason of spending where, you know, it feels like they would do what the Padres did a couple years ago when they signed Manny Machado and they had that period where they signed Eric Hosmer. They're bringing in pitcher after pitcher. They're making trades. Like, I could see a situation like that, but I don't know if I could pinpoint a year in which that happens. I always believe that they're going to be hanging around that 15 to 25 range, and who knows, maybe 15th is the highest they could get to. It's the reality of small market teams, but also owners can spend. That ever since the players' strike, it has put me on the side of owners can spend money. We saw with the Athletics this offseason, they finally started spending money once they left Oakland. They can do it. You don't want to be reckless with your spending, but I do believe the Royals, what they did last year, that should be kind of the expectation every single offseason. When you got holes to fill, you want to jump on those, but you also can't just be reckless and sign everybody by November or December. Sometimes you have to be a little bit more patient, but I do like that question. I think that the highest they could get is 10th, but I also think they're always going to be hanging around 15 to 25, in my opinion. That's just kind of what they've been the last couple of years. You know, I don't see them ever getting back to when they were in the bottom 5 in payroll. I think that by the end of each offseason, they will pretty firmly be in that 15 to 25 range. Sam's question is, I know Profar, Santander, and Bregman and other big names are still out there in free agency, but if you had to choose one under-the-radar guy still available, who would it be and why? You know, Randall Grichuk is a name I did just bring up, and I'll throw him in there as a dark horse candidate because he's a corner outfielder. I thought he did really well with Arizona last year in a limited role. He's a name that I think you can certainly be watching. Another one that comes to mind, you know, it's not free agency. This is the trade route again. I'm circling back to these two names. Mike Yastrzemski and Lamont Wade Jr. in San Francisco feel like two guys that still could get moved. And I do feel like they could be fits in Kansas City, more so Yastrzemski than Lamont Wade Jr. And I do think, you know, he's been an above-average hitter, speaking of Yastrzemski, over the last 4 to 5 years. He's not the big-time pop you're hoping for at the middle of the lineup, but I think he'd be a nice addition to the team. But free agency-wise, I mean, that's kind of the problem is until those guys start flying off the list, those under-the-radar names won't start becoming that prominent. But Grichuk, to me, is the one that I keep going back to of he'd be cheap. It'd likely be a one-year deal. That's a middle-of-the-order bat. He does have power. He showcased it before. And I thought he was great in Arizona last year. I think some of the advanced, batted ball metrics also support, Randall Grichuk as well. So he's that name that I keep going back to, especially over the last week or so, just because I think he'd be cheap. I think that some of those smaller market teams, I know Pittsburgh was interested in somebody else I'm blanking on right now, was also interested in Randall Grichuk. But if the Royals swing and miss or can't strike a deal with anybody else on the top of their list, I think he's somebody that would make a lot of sense. Evan asks, biggest area of concern for next season, and who are you most excited to see? Biggest area of concern is either the lineup, and more specifically the bottom half of the lineup, or number two would be, the rotation regressing. Because the rotation and the defense were the biggest reason why this team won 86 games. So my biggest area of concern would be, well, what if that rotation regresses? And doesn't just slightly regress. I'm talking about, a drastic difference from the first year to the second year. But I think with what you have right now, the lineup has to be the biggest concern because that's what eliminated you from the postseason. They still need help in that lineup. They need depth in that lineup, and they just don't have it right now. Not on January 17th. I might have a different answer on February 17th, or I might have a different answer on March 25th, a few days before opening day. But I just think that the lineup is going to be the thing that makes or breaks this team and will ultimately decide if they can return to the postseason and, more importantly, make a deeper run than Game 4 of the American League Divisional Series. But good question there from Evan. Also, the second part to that, who are you most excited to see? Just because he's new, I think Jonathan India. I mean, obviously, I think the easy answer would be Bobby Witt Jr. or Vinny Pasquantino coming back from injury. But I do think Jonathan India, because he's the new face, because he's going to be the new leadoff bat, he will be the one that I'm most excited to see. But fingers crossed that they bring in a big-time middle-of-the-order bat that can leapfrog Jonathan India for the guy that everybody is the most excited to see. RB Carr asks if the Royals acquire an outfielder for their middle-of-the-order bat who doesn't make the opening day roster. Isbel, Melendez, or Renfroe, or Blanco, or do they carry 5 outfielders? I would imagine Blanco would be the odd man out there just because MJ Melendez, they'll like the power off the bench. Renfroe and Isbel I view as starters on opening day. So Blanco to me would be the odd man out there. Tom asks, listening to JJ, it sounds like Lorenzen is in the rotation. Do you think, assuming he makes the rotation, it's Marsh or Bubic in the bullpen? Or is there any chance they would go with a 6-man rotation to keep inning counts a little lower for guys at the start of the year? I don't think they'll need to go 6-man rotation to begin the year because, remember, there's all those off days in April. So you might have 4 guys in the rotation to begin the year and have a little extra help in the bullpen. But I right now think the rotation is going to be Cole Reagan, Seth Lugo, Michael Wacha, Michael Lorenzen, and Chris Bubic. I think Alec Marsh goes to the bullpen. I would like to see what type of role he'd be in there. My guess would be long relief alongside Daniel Lynch. But the good thing about Chris Bubic in the rotation is if it doesn't work out, he can work in the bullpen. That's why I think they're moving him to the rotation to see if he can have a higher ceiling, a higher upside as a starter again, as opposed to being a back-end bullpen guy. Because if it doesn't work out, you can move Alec Marsh to the rotation or Daniel Lynch to the rotation or Kyle Wright to the rotation, and you can bounce Bubic back to the 7th or the 8th inning role. Jason asks, the Royals have been linked to Taylor Ward for a while. What is wrong with him that Anaheim would want to trade him? It's not that something's wrong with him. I think it's that the Angels likely understand where they're at. They know they're not a serious contender. They did make some moves this offseason, but none of them really made me feel differently about them contending in the American League West. Taylor Ward is going to be 30 years old. In fact, I think he's 30 right now. This will be going into his age 31 season. And he's got one more year of control. And he's also playing the best he has in his career. If you're the Angels, it's about capitalizing when that player is at peak value. And I think they're trying to ask for a lot for Taylor Ward, and no team is really budging on it. I think that most teams understand the true value of Taylor Ward, and the Angels are doing what most underachieving teams going into the year are doing. I think they're trying to leverage some of their best trade chips, and they want a desperate team to bite. They also know that Taylor Ward makes them better in 2025. So maybe there's that internal discussion of, hey, let's not move him now. Let's wait and see till the trade deadline. And if we're out of it, now we will trade Taylor Ward. But I still hope they do move him before the start of the offseason, because I said basically the time the offseason started to now, I think Taylor Ward is the perfect fit for Kansas City in their outfield and for the middle of the order bat. And lastly, Prepsley asked, I saw that Santander was open to taking a shorter deal. I feel like that should be very good for us. Yeah, a lot of questions about Santander today, but I just don't think it'll be, a deal that the Royals would be interested in doing because I don't see it getting down to a 1 or 2 year deal. I see it being more so 3 to a 4 year deal. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. Thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen today. For your second, find Locked On MLB as baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. We'll be off this weekend, of course, unless they make a move. But we'll be back on Tuesday, another morning episode as we get closer and closer to spring training. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.